edition of our Industries at Work COVID-19 podcast series, Council Market Intelligence Director Rob Boyce chats with Chad Hoppenjan, Assistant Vice President of Cottingham and Butler's Safety Management Services Company. The conversation covers trucking safety during the pandemic. For those hauling essential goods, it's about safety at terminals, lounges, and rest stops. It's about procuring food and extended hours. They also discuss the silver linings of the pandemic, such as more streamlined and cost-effective onboarding practices for truckers and improvements to driver training, as well as the industry's response to relaxed regulations. Join us for this deeper dive into trucking safety.
Chad, thanks so much for joining us today. I hope you're doing well.
Hey, Rob. Thanks for having me.
Let's jump right in. Through working for a Safety Management Services Company, a division of Cottingham and Butler, you work closely with the transportation industry and specifically trucking. You've seen the impacts that COVID-19 has had on the sector firsthand. Clearly, we are in unprecedented times. To start things off, can you briefly describe COVID-19's impact on the sector, and more specifically, what risk managers are focusing on during the pandemic and what new exposures, if any, have risen?
Thanks, Rob. As a safety consultant, we've seen all kinds of different issues arise because of COVID, and a lot of different exposures have come about from it. A couple things that motor carriers really took for granted in the past, simple things like shop personnel, getting in and out of the trucks, the drivers coming in and out of a terminal, the drivers coming in and out of their drivers' lounges, things like that. Fleets have really taken for granted, and now they've really had to look at how are they going about sanitizing those areas and really trying to protect their employees, not only the drivers, but all employees that are working in their offices. Other issues that the drivers face, that they, again, probably have taken for granted, interacting with their shippers, what they can and can't do. Simple things such as using a bathroom have become more and more difficult, and in some cases may put some exposure on the drivers. Other areas, dealing with rest stops, some of them may be closed, therefore they're not able to stop as they normally would, which could extend their hours, which could lead to fatigue, things like that. Other things, simply just getting a meal, being able to stop at a restaurant. Some restaurants have been closed. Other ones, the trucks cannot just go through a drive-through. So it makes it a little bit more difficult for them to try to find things like that.
Great, thanks. And then operationally, have you seen a change? A lot of corporate companies have shifted to work from home, and that for a lot of folks have been successful. Have you seen any change from that front?
Sure. It really varies from fleet to fleet. We've definitely seen some fleets that have given their employees an option. You can come into their offices, or they allow them to work from home. In most cases, it's been varied across the board, and I think there's been different levels of successes with that. But for the most part, from the clients that we speak with, their employees want to come into work, and they've done different things with social distancing and, personal protective equipment, things like that to try to keep their employees safe. But they've really had to be smart about how they have their offices set up. And in some cases, they've had to make employees work from home just due to the amount of space that they may or may not have.
Great, and we'll talk more on that later. In regards to the supply chain, if there has been a supply chain slowdown, how and has this impacted the demand for truckers across the nation?
In terms of supply chain, that's a little bit out of my area, but from what we've been hearing, it really varies from fleet to fleet, really on what they're hauling. In some industries, it's really picked up, the healthcare industry and medical supplies and things like that. Other industries, it's really, really slowed down. And, fleets have tried to find other means, to try to recoup some of that revenue. But for the most part, I think it has hit fleets hard. And I think COVID definitely has been a negative for a lot of fleets that are out there.
Interesting. So when you talk about the job market, Can you speak to how the job market was in the trucking sector prior to COVID and how it's been impacted throughout the pandemic?
Again, very similar to the supply chain. It varies from fleet to fleet, but the job market prior to COVID, for the most part, was very hot. I mean, drivers had their selection of a lot of different fleets that they'd want to go to. For the fleets, that's a good thing. We're able to find the so-called better, safer drivers that were available. After COVID hit, it really slowed down, and drivers were laid off, employees were laid off in many different companies, and again, but it varies, really from fleet to fleet and industry to industry in terms of who they're hauling for and what they have available. But for the most part, it was hot prior to COVID and really cooled off once COVID hit.
All right, great. And I'm going a little off topic here, but just curious, regarding the transition to online sales during COVID, has this impacted the trucking industry at all in regards to different types of being products delivered in different ways? I'm thinking of Amazon stock skyrocketing while others are really falling. Has this impacted the trucking industry at all?
It certainly impacted the trucking industry. In terms of, the online sales, it really depends, again, on the industry. Retail sales, I would assume, has slowed down, and some fleets that we work with, definitely, haul for some retail stores. The Amazons are a little bit different, and in those cases, you do have some of your traditional motor carriers, over-the-road motor carriers that do haul for Amazon. But in reality, Amazon has a lot of private carriers that haul for them as well.
So how about new drivers and training during the pandemic? What changes have been made here to protect not only new drivers in training, but those doing the training?
So in terms of new driver training, and really for me and my team, it's more safety training. I think there's been some very positive changes, and I think fleets have been forced to utilize, virtual training, remote training for their drivers in terms of onboarding, in addition to some of the training that they do when a driver does come into their offices. A lot of fleets were using Zoom and other virtual training systems prior to COVID. However, many fleets now are utilizing Zoom and similar virtual training aspects since COVID hit. So in reality, it's helped them streamline, I think, their onboarding process, and maybe even made it a little more cost effective if they should have outlying terminals. So they're able to Zoom and maybe taking some of that responsibility away from some of those employees that were located in those outlying terminals, and really standardize their onboarding where maybe they hadn't in the past.
So do you think this could be a catalyst for change for the good? When this is all behind us, do you think the industry will continue using these practices and continue to cut costs and train remotely, just like folks are, across all industries likely going to be working remotely more often now?
I think, the onset of COVID, and in this area, I think there's definitely some pros and cons. The positives for sure would be able to make their onboarding process a lot more consistent if they're able to utilize Zoom, again, for those terminals that are located away from, the parent company location or the corporate office. The nice thing about, again, utilizing Zoom is you can have a live new hire orientation going on at a corporate office, while at the same time having other locations live as well. So they're getting the same message no matter where they're hired into. Some of the cons to that, though, is, there's really no replacement for that personal touch, when you're dealing directly face-to-face, with the employees at those corporate offices, or even, at those terminal locations. you really can't replace that hands-on training that you may be losing a little bit right now because of the COVID crisis.
Right. So switching gears, the term civil authority, it was, all over the place months ago, and states are already beginning to reopen, but there is the risk of phase 2 of COVID-19. And if this does happen again with the closure of rest stops, fast food restaurants, restrooms, and other facilities, how are truck drivers being impacted? And could this potentially lead to an increase in fatigue on the road with folks not being able to stop or simply just not wanting to, because of the pandemic?
I think inevitably it could increase fatigue if drivers cannot find safe locations to park and, to stop and get their rest. I think what it does do, though, is a positive in that it forces drivers to really plan their trips. It forces the operations teams of all fleets really to plan their trips as best they can. And I think it forces the actual company's operations teams to lay out, where are safe locations along the route where their drivers can stop to eat, to rest, things like that. So planning is huge. I think that is a huge positive that will come out of this, is just forcing everybody to plan better.
Interesting. And are fleets using any on-road technologies to help, keep in touch and increase the lines of communication while on the road?
Yeah, I mean, most fleets now have some type of, ELD system, their electronic logs. And within those ELD systems, there's instant messaging. A lot of fleets are utilizing that. Texting of drivers is still there, although, they have to be careful about when they text a driver, what they're texting drivers, things like that. But I think technology-wise, most fleets that are out there have the ability to contact the drivers as often as they need to without being a distraction to the drivers on the road. I mean, they just have to be careful of that in terms of the safety aspect of it.
Great. And so on the regulatory front, due to COVID, the Department of Transportation took additional steps to make truck drivers more available to haul essential supplies during the outbreak. So this led to broadening exemptions from hours of service rules to suspending enforcement of licensing information. Can you elaborate on that and just give us a few words on how companies are approaching these new lax measures and some risks that are associated with this?
Yeah, so the FMCSA, or the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, did take some unprecedented steps to offer some exemptions to those motor carriers that are hauling essential goods. From what we can tell in communicating with our clients, it really hasn't affected them, only because they've decided to stick to the original regulations before the exemptions were put out there. So in terms of hours of service, they were operating as they would prior to COVID. In terms of licensing and those types of things, they're trying to do what they could prior to COVID. Really, the impetus behind that is they want to make sure their drivers are safe on the road. They want to make sure the general public is safe on the road. And in reality, trying to stay away from any type of litigation should that bad crash occur and they weren't following the original regulations that were out there, even though there was an exemption there.
So when it comes to off the road maintenance shops, driver lounges, other areas of mass gatherings, how has social distancing requirements impacted this, and what are risk managers doing to combat this risk?
That's a great question. I think this is an area that is extremely, extremely difficult for a motor carrier to manage, just because they really haven't had to manage this before. So when you think of just maintenance shops and drivers lounges and just general offices, the sanitation aspect of it, making sure things are all wiped down and clean. In terms of a driver's lounge, simple things like the remote control to a TV, telephones, the bathrooms, the faucets, the door handles, all those types of things. There's no more bringing in pizzas and food and things like that for the drivers, unless it's individually wrapped type food. In terms of just the maintenance shop, you're dealing with, maintenance employees getting in and out of a truck. So therefore they're touching door handles and grab bars and steering wheels and radio controls and things like that. So making sure those are all wiped down so you don't have exposure to the maintenance professional. Then the drivers, once they get back into those trucks after they've been serviced, the same type of thing, making sure there's sanitation there. And then just, dealing with employees in the office and interacting with the drivers, trying to keep their distance. And some of these offices, there isn't a ton of room. So it's difficult for them to be able to distance themselves, even though they're trying as much as possible. So, personal protective equipment has been big, and making sure that the employees that need it are issued it, they're trained on how to use it appropriately, things like that.
Right, and I mean there are always trucks on the road, so I'm sure what makes it difficult is it's a 24-hour job. There will always be drivers stopping and, like you said, using the remote or getting on the computer. When it comes to working with third parties, I'm talking about delivering packages or working. When you get to your destination, have there been any changes on how drivers are interacting with the folks who are on the receiving end?
Again, that's another difficult one. I think for the drivers, it's extremely difficult because the shippers and the locations, where the drivers are, dropping their freight or hauling their freight to, they want to eliminate any type of interaction. So, drivers may have to stay in their vehicles. They may have to go to designated areas that maybe aren't conducive to the normal aspect of their job. Using a restroom has become very difficult. In reality, it makes the driver's job very difficult. And I think the fleets and the motor carriers are working to communicate with those shippers and customers to make sure that their drivers have somewhere to go when they get to those locations if they need something, whether it be a snack, a beverage, again, to use a bathroom, things like that, just in the normal day-to-day aspect that they deal with.
Do you think there's been an increase in drivers sleeping in their cabs? I would imagine so, but I just wanted to ask.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, for those drivers that have the ability to do that, if their truck is equipped with a sleeper, for sure, I think that's something, because I think the driver's safer in their cab than they would be trying to go to a hotel in some cases. Some hotels aren't even open for them to be able to do that. So I think there is more utilization of it if, again, their truck is equipped with a sleeper.
Right. So we touched on driver training. In regards to on-road testing, how has COVID affected this? And do you think these more remote practices will continue?
So, the on-road testing or road testing, one big thing about the road testing, although it's a great best practice, it's not a requirement, by the FMCSA that all drivers are road tested. Again, if you're talking to me, for sure, we would want to road test drivers. Well, COVID hit, and it does make road testing more difficult. Some fleets have decided to suspend their road testing, which, could lead to a driver that maybe is getting in a vehicle that cannot operate it as effectively as what the fleet would want. If they would have done a road test, they may have figured that out. Some fleets have, tried to be a little, they've tried to make some arrangements where they can still road test, although it's done in a different fashion, such as maybe they have a closed course where they can follow behind a driver to make sure they can, adequately operate the vehicle. Other fleets have actually had driver trainers outfitted with personal protective equipment and still doing the normal road test. Now you do have some driver trainers or road testing employees that say, hey, I don't feel comfortable getting in that truck with, a driver, so I'm not going to do it. And that's something that's definitely crept up to some fleets, and they've had to make some tough decisions based on that.
Mhm. So all in all, and for good or for bad, do you think COVID's current impact on the trucking industry could result in any long-term changes that we might see far outside the pandemic?
In terms of long-term changes, I think I mentioned communication before, and I think, motor carriers and drivers, I honestly believe that their communication is going to be increased, after this COVID crisis, which I think is a win-win for both the fleet and the driver. I think the operations team has to look out for the drivers, and the drivers are going to feel more comfortable with the operations team and the fact that they feel that they're being taken care of. The fleets that can do that, I think this is a definite win for them. In terms of other changes, I think hopefully, federal, state, local governments are going to be able to hopefully figure out a way to find better parking should, a second wave of this creep up, maybe later this year or next year or whenever. But finding better parking for drivers, finding available locations for food, showers, bathrooms, things like that. I think, the government entities in every state needs to figure that out and be better about that to really support the drivers. I mean, without them, the freight is not going to get to where it is, and it's going to hurt all consumers. So I really think the governments need to figure that out. And then in terms of, sanitation, I think all companies, most companies in the country are going to be way smarter in that area. And I think are going to be better off because of the COVID to understand, what they need to do in terms of sanitation to keep their facilities safe for their employees, safe for the outside public should they, start allowing the public back into some of the locations, things like that.
Right, and we discussed this on a prior call. Viral diseases, they're not specific to COVID. We've always had a flu season, and while COVID-19, we might get a vaccine or this might go away over time, hopefully this sanitation, the lessons learned around it will continue, and it'll prevent the spread of disease.
For sure.
So I'm going to end on a big picture question. And as you think about lessons learned and your experience over the past few months in regard to managing the challenges associated with the health and economic crisis, what is something that you would start doing after the pandemic, something you would stop, and something that you will or should continue doing? This can be personally, professionally, or industry related.
From a professional level, I really believe that the remote communication, the virtual meetings, that's something that I know my team is going to continue to do, and hopefully we get better at and continue to improve upon. But I think it's a value add, and I think it is definitely a useful tool should you get into a pinch or you're unable to travel to a certain location. I think in terms of, a personal aspect, one thing that I'm going to continue to do that maybe I haven't done so much in the past is, just the constant hand washing, the constant utilization of, hand sanitizer, and being cognizant of, just overall hygiene in those different areas that maybe you've taken for granted in the past. And what was your other question? I apologize.
Something that you might stop doing.
Oh, in reality, as far as stop doing, I can't think of too much that I'm going to change in terms of stop doing. I think it's just a matter of the things that I do on a day-to-day basis, or even my team does on a day-to-day basis. I think we just have to be smarter and more aware about what we're doing. I don't anticipate anything that we're just going to flat out stop doing. And I think that's, one misconception with all this in COVID is that, hey, we need to stop doing our day-to-day tasks. And maybe there's some things that will change. But in all reality, for what we do, and whether it's professionally or personally, I think we just all need to be aware and just more, like I said, more cognizant of our surroundings, really watch what we're doing, and not only be cognizant of ourselves, but how we potentially affect other people.
Right. Well, all in all, we're in some interesting times, but it sounds like there may be a few silver linings through your experiences and the industry as a whole. And, again, we really appreciate you providing your expertise today and really look forward to keeping in touch going forward.
Thank you, Rob. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks, Chad. Thanks for your time and have a great day.